Ben is leaving. But I wanted to say, first of all, to Ben, I'm really sorry that he got stuck with that reading this morning. Kind of an unpleasant reading for a young man. But in my own defense, as you know, this is a sermon series on the hard sayings of Jesus. And I think this qualifies. Anybody who is a counselor, a therapist, or a minister, anybody who is a good friend or family member to someone who is experiencing the trauma of separation or divorce, or the ending of any significant relationship, will know what a terribly painful experience this can be. And many of us in this room, of course, have felt that pain ourselves. And the problem is often exacerbated when the one who is ending a relationship is a person of faith, who then too often also has to deal with the guilt of breaking an oath made sometime before in good faith before God. It would be nice to say that when we go through difficult times like this, that the scriptures of our faith and the support of a faith community provide a measure of comfort and support for us. But sadly, that's not always the case. What was helpful to me was my own experience of God, of what God was like, of who God had been to me in my life. Not a God who waits for God's children to make a mistake and then pounces on them with punishment and condemnation, but rather a God who walks with us, a God who understands and forgives. And because for me, Scripture was singularly unhelpful, what also helped eventually was to begin to understand something of the context in which Jesus' words concerning marriage and divorce were first spoken and then eventually written down. To understand the social and cultural context in which Jesus lived and to which Jesus spoke is really important, but it's not a simple task either. Because the time was very different from our own, the place was totally different from our own, the language was different, and the laws and the practices and the customs, all different. It seems like an understatement, but still needs to be said, that Jesus' world, the world that Jesus lived and ministered in, was a patriarchal, male-dominated world. And in this world that Jesus lived in and which he ministered, a woman was scarcely even a person in her own right. In the legal provisions of that culture at that time, the woman was actually a chattel. She was the property of a male. So the Mishnah, that body of Jewish oral law built upon the teachings of the Old Testament, stated she continues within the control of her father until she enters into the control of her husband at marriage. Not very pleasant stuff. And because of this understanding of a woman's place in that culture and society, marriages were prearranged. And it would appear that the accepted age for matchmaking was when a girl was technically a nara, around the age of 12. If a father had not betrothed his daughter before she reached the age of 12 and a half, well, he was sadly remiss. And so, of course, male privilege riddled the divorce provisions as well as the marriage customs. The book of Deuteronomy puts it this way: and it's pretty harsh. Suppose a man enters into a marriage with a woman, but then she does not please him because he finds something objectionable about her. He writes out a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. So a Jewish man could divorce his wife just like that, but of course a Jewish woman could not divorce her husband because divorce was a male privilege. So there is no doubt but that the Bible records an aggressive male superiority. But did God will that? Was that God's intention and God's purpose? Does the sexist prejudice in the Bible reflect the mind and the will and the intention of God? I don't think so. With this partial understanding of the milieu within which Jesus lived, we turn now to what Jesus himself had to say about marriage and divorce. And some of the words from that reading are part of many a wedding service today in Christian churches. What therefore God has joined together, let no one put asunder. So one of the questions, and maybe the most important question for us, becomes then, well, what or who does God join together? Does God intend, does God in fact join together that 12-year-old girl whose marriage to some stranger is arranged by her father? Is God really party to that kind of what amounts to a business transaction? Alfred Lukács gives a most incisive character sketch of some people who come to churches to make marriage vows. He writes, when adult infants marry, when the boy looking for a mother marries the girl looking for a father, the crash comes. So does God join those two people together? Or take another character, and this is from Jules Pfeiffer's play, Little Murders. And in that play, the character Patsy, at one point, screams at her husband, Alfred, "You son of a bitch," she says, "I'll tear you limb from limb. I married you because I wanted to mold you. I loved the man I wanted to mold you into." So do you think God joins those two people together? And these are not uncommon examples, nor is, emotional and physical abuse, And we'll see how that works. These are not uncommon examples, nor is emotional and physical abuse, or exploitation, or people who marry out of a sense of desperation, or out of unexamined needs, or societal pressure, or out of a sense of duty. Do you really think we have the right to deposit that pathology, that sickness, at God's doorstep? What or who does God join together? Surely not people like these. Many years ago, the United Church produced a study document that was called Marriage Today. And that document suggested that the heart of marriage is intimacy. Intimacy, it says, has to do with the distance or the closeness between people. It involves trusting another person sufficiently to let down those protective barriers, to take away those facades, in order to let another see one as one really is, in all of their fragility and all of their strength. In time, in trust, what is revealed will be valued and graciously received. It's this kind of intimacy that is both the lure and the promise of marriage. One does not achieve that kind of intimacy, I don't think, through force or law or commandment, but through the free personal giving of the self in trust. Many people would say, correctly I think, that what God desires for God's people is connection, is relationship. Where people might disagree is whether this is seen as God's loving intention and desire for people on the one hand, or whether this is seen as law and commandment on the other hand. The difference, of course, lies between intention and law. It's fairly clear, I think, what God intends for humanity. One has only to read Jesus' Sermon on the Mount to know what God intends for us. God intends that we be happy, even when people insult us and persecute us and tell all kinds of evil lies against us because we are God's followers. That's God's intention for us, apparently. Now, we don't always achieve that high ideal, but we strive to achieve it because that's what God intends. God intends us to be like salt and light for the whole world, so that people will see the good and give glory to God. But we also fail to do that sometimes, and we need forgiveness, and we need another chance. But that doesn't change the fact that that is God's intention for us. God intends that we never come before God's altar until we are first reconciled to all of our sisters and brothers. Well, that seems pretty much impossible most of the time. Nevertheless, even as we recognize our occasional failure and our need for God's mercy, we try to be reconciled to one another because that's what God intends. God intends that we never even think angry or lustful thoughts. Well, good luck with that. God intends that we turn the other cheek when somebody hurts us. God intends us to give away our shirt as well as our coat. God intends us to love not just our friends, but also our enemies, the very people who hate and hurt us the most. So it's very clear what God intends for us. And in all of these things, we try, we strive, we struggle, we do our very best. But we never fully achieve any one of these. And so we need God's forgiveness, God's mercy, and God's grace. Well, the high ideal that Jesus seems to have held for marriage is similar to these other high ideals for Christian living that Jesus taught us. Unfortunately, while we hope and work and wait expectantly for the realm of God, we do not yet fully live in that realm. Jesus looked forward to a time when God's realm would be realized, when God's people would live in complete harmony and shalom. And St. Paul also taught that Christians, even though they were already part of the new age, nevertheless still lived under the old age, with all of its ambiguity, with all of its questions, with all of its challenges, and yes, with all of its pain. So, what is the role of the church in all of this? Well, the church has a responsibility to uphold marriage and other committed covenant relationships as good, God-given gifts to God's people and community. And at the same time, the church also needs to be an instrument of healing and comfort when such high ideals cannot be achieved. Remember, the highest law of Christ is the law of compassion. The Church can take both marriage and divorce seriously. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. The Church needs to recognize and state explicitly that the ending of a marriage is no less forgivable than any other failure or shortcoming, nor is it always tragic. Indeed, in some cases, and we've all seen this, divorce is by far the most loving and faithful choice to make. Divorce, while always painful and difficult, may enable two people and the ones they love to begin the process of healing, and at its very best and at its most hopeful, of relating to one another in a new way, a way that includes the possibility of friendship and genuine caring. Such recognition would place the Church exactly where it needs to be, right in the midst of human pain, brokenness, and failure. We do not live in a perfect world. Our vision of perfection is constantly compromised, and some of our deepest hopes and some of our most cherished dreams are never realized. It is in these moments that the Church needs to be there to meet us in our pain, to enable us to stand even though we have fallen, and give us the courage to live again, to love again, and to risk again. Once every effort has been made to heal and to transform the brokenness of our human lives, when that struggle has been engaged deeply and honestly, then the Church needs to be there with her hurting people, with a faith that embraces the past in forgiveness and looks forward to the future in hope. There are many roads in this journey that we call human life, and we don't always choose the best one. Sometimes we choose the wrong one. Excuse me. But we serve a God who can bring resurrection out of crucifixion. We serve a God who brings life out of death, who brings joy out of sorrow, and redemption out of pain. Perhaps this God can also bring us to fulfillment despite our mistakes, and to wholeness despite our brokenness. In that hope, we all live. Thanks be to God.